October 16, 1940. The North Atlantic heaved beneath a moonless sky, black and endless. On the bridge of the British freighter SS Empire Miniver, the wind screamed through the rigging, carrying the sting of salt and diesel. Men spoke little. They all knew this stretch of ocean had become a graveyard. Convoy SC-7 was crawling west of Ireland. 35 merchant ships in tight formation, their running lights extinguished, escorted by a handful of weary corvettes. The sea was calm, too calm. Then, at 01:27, a blinding flash erupted mid-column. A column of fire shot skyward as the Miniver vanished beneath a curtain of flame. Seconds later, another explosion. Then another. Through binoculars, the escort commander caught a glimpse of white foam slicing across the waves. A torpedo wake. The Wolfpack had found them. Radios screamed with panic before cutting to static. Men leapt into freezing water slicked with burning oil. The Atlantic, once a vast highway of commerce, had become a killing ground. That night, 7 ships were lost. 1 U-boat slipped away unseen. The ocean was no longer a passage, it was a battlefield. And, for the Allies, the battle to take it back had only just begun. When war erupted in September 1939, Britain once again faced the same dilemma it had known in the First World War. The island could not feed itself. More than half its food, oil, and raw materials came by sea. If those lifelines were cut, defeat would not come by invasion, but by starvation. The Royal Navy, proud and vast, believed it could keep the sea lanes open. Yet across the North Sea, Germany was preparing a weapon that would challenge that supremacy. Admiral Karl Dönitz's U-boot-Waffe, a submarine force built for silent, coordinated destruction. Dönitz, himself a veteran submariner, understood something few others did. One submarine was dangerous, but a Wolfpack could paralyze entire convoys. Britain had faced U-boats before. In 1917, the convoy system, grouping merchant ships under escort, had turned the tide. But 2 decades of peace had dulled that lesson. When the new war began, many British commanders still believed scattered independent sailings would be safer. It was a fatal misjudgment. By the winter of 1939, German U-boats were striking deep into the Atlantic. The loss of the passenger liner Athenia, torpedoed on the very first day of the war, sent a grim message. Civilians were no longer off-limits. In the months that followed, ships went down almost daily. Tankers, freighters, troop ships, all easy prey for hunters beneath the waves. Convoys were reintroduced late in 1939. But the escort ships were few, and detection equipment crude. The North Atlantic was vast, and air patrols reached only a fraction of it. There existed a dark zone, the Black Pit, where no aircraft could protect the convoys. That was the U-boat's hunting ground. Then came the fall of France in June 1940, and with it, catastrophe for Allied shipping. German submarines no longer had to slip through the narrow North Sea. They could now operate from French Atlantic ports, Lorient, Brest, Saint-Nazaire, cutting weeks off their travel time and striking directly into the mid-Atlantic. The wolves could hunt longer, hit harder, and return home faster. Each night brought new horror. Ships like the City of Benares, carrying child evacuees, were torpedoed without warning. Merchant sailors fought fires, patched holes, and watched friends vanish into freezing seas. By 1941, Britain was losing ships faster than it could build them. To coordinate defenses, the British established the Western Approaches Command in Liverpool, transforming the port into the nerve center of the Atlantic War. There, officers began to perfect the convoy doctrine, assigning code names, plotting tracks, and experimenting with early radar and sonar systems. Yet even as they adapted, Dönitz refined his Wolfpack tactics. U-boats operated in coordinated lines, guided by encrypted radio signals, attacking under cover of night when escorts were blind. Meanwhile, across the ocean, the United States watched uneasily. Officially neutral, America had no desire to fight Germany again. But President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood that Britain's fall would leave America isolated. Step by step, he edged closer to involvement, ordering neutrality patrols in the Western Atlantic, authorizing destroyers to report U-boat sightings, and even transferring 50 aging destroyers to Britain in exchange for base rights. The Atlantic, once a bridge between continents, had become a gray frontier of undeclared war. American and British ships were already sharing intelligence, convoy routes, and sometimes gunfire. By the summer of 1941, Britain's endurance was near breaking point. Every convoy that reached its shores was a small miracle, the result of courage, coordination, and luck. But the tide of destruction was still rising. And when the United States finally entered the war, that fragile lifeline would become an industrial crusade, a machine built to feed, arm, and save the free world. December 7, 1941, the day Pearl Harbor burned, changed everything. Overnight, the United States became not just a supplier, but a combatant. The Atlantic War that had once been Britain's burden now belonged to both nations. But in truth, America had already been fighting it in all but name. The Lend-Lease Act, passed months earlier, had opened the floodgates of U.S. industry to Britain and its allies. Tanks, trucks, aircraft, ammunition, and above all, ships. The American challenge was staggering: to move millions of tons of material across oceans stalked by submarines. The solution was the convoy, but at a scale the world had never seen. Every week, convoys bearing code names like HX, Halifax to Liverpool, SC, Sydney, Nova Scotia to the Clyde, and on outbound to North America, threaded through the Atlantic, guarded by destroyers, corvettes, and patrol aircraft. Each convoy was a floating city. Dozens of ships, thousands of men, all bound by shared fate. To feed that system, America unleashed its greatest weapon: industry. In shipyards from Baltimore to Portland, cranes worked day and night. The Liberty ship became the symbol of that effort. A simple, rugged cargo vessel that could be welded together in weeks instead of months. Henry Kaiser's revolutionary assembly line techniques turned shipbuilding into mass production. By 1943, 3 new Liberty ships were sliding into the water every day. But the U-boats adapted faster than expected. In early 1942, with the U.S. coastline poorly defended and its cities brightly lit, German submarines launched Operation Paukenschlag, drumbeat. From the Carolinas to New York Harbor, tankers and freighters were torpedoed in plain sight. It was, in Donitz's words, the second happy time. In 6 months, over 3 million tons of shipping were lost. More than in all of 1941, America had to learn quickly and brutally. Coastal blackouts were imposed. Convoy systems expanded to cover the entire Western Atlantic. New escort carriers brought air cover to the mid-ocean gap, while long-range patrol aircraft, the consolidated B-24 Liberators, finally closed the skies over the Black Pit. Technology shifted the balance. Radar could now detect periscopes. Sonar grew more precise. HFDF, high-frequency direction-finding stations, triangulated U-boat radio calls within minutes. Every convoy became not just a cluster of ships, but a moving sensor network. Behind the front lines, American industry churned relentlessly. Factories built depth charges, hedgehog mortars, and sonar equipment by the thousands. Shipyards repaired torpedoed vessels in record time. And through Lend-Lease, supplies reached Britain, North Africa, and even the Soviet Union, where American trucks and fuel became the backbone of the Red Army's mobility. By mid-1943, the battle's tempo had shifted. For the first time, U-boat losses exceeded Allied sinkings. Escort groups, now trained, coordinated, and lethal, turned from defense to offense. Convoy HX-237, ON-207, and others became turning points. The hunters had become the hunted. The Atlantic, once ruled by shadow and fear, was slowly being reclaimed by discipline, data, and steel. And behind that transformation lay countless hidden struggles, human, technological, and moral, the angles that would decide the fate of the war at sea. They were not soldiers, not in the traditional sense. The men who crewed the convoys were civilians, sailors, engineers, cooks, and teenagers fresh from port towns. Yet their battlefield was as deadly as any front line. The merchant navy suffered casualty rates higher than any other Allied service. Each voyage across the Atlantic was a gamble against the odds. Convoys could take 2 weeks to cross, their ships crawling through fog, storms, and darkness at 8 knots, the speed of the slowest vessel. Every sound, every glimmer of light, could betray them to submarines lurking beneath. On the bridge, convoy commodores navigated through blacked-out nights, often with nothing but a compass and dead reckoning. In the engine rooms below, men worked stripped to the waist, sweat dripping as they coaxed boilers to life, knowing that one torpedo could turn the compartment into a furnace. For the escorts, corvette and destroyer crews, the war was a test of nerves and endurance. The Royal Navy's small Flower-class corvettes, hastily built in shipyards meant for trawlers, pitched and rolled in heavy seas until men were too seasick to stand. Yet, these ships became the lifeguards of the Atlantic, charging toward torpedo wakes, firing depth charges into the void, never certain if they had struck the enemy or only the deep. Letters home spoke of endless fatigue and frozen fear. "It's the silence that kills you," one seaman wrote. "You listen for the sound, the one you never want to hear." That sound, the low metallic groan of a torpedo, meant seconds to live. And yet, despite the terror, they sailed again. Ship after ship, convoy after convoy, the lifeline held. They were ordinary men doing an extraordinary thing, keeping the free world alive. At first, the Atlantic War was fought by instinct and eyesight. Escorts hunted by listening through hydrophones and staring into the fog. But as losses mounted, science entered the fray. The first breakthrough came with ASDIC, the early form of sonar, a system that sent sound waves through the water and listened for echoes bouncing off submarine hulls. It could reveal a hidden U-boat, but only when the ship was almost on top of it. In the chaos of convoy attacks, ASDIC's limits were cruel. Once a submarine dove deep or slipped beneath the convoy, contact was often lost. Then came radar, crude, flickering, and miraculous. With it, escorts could spot periscopes at night or catch U-boats surfacing to recharge batteries. The Germans countered with snorkels and radar detectors, but the advantage had shifted. By 1942, innovation accelerated. Hedgehog, a forward-throwing weapon that launched dozens of small contact bombs ahead of the ship, replaced blind depth charging. Instead of exploding at preset depths, Hedgehog bombs detonated only when they hit metal, allowing escorts to know instantly if they had scored a kill. And above the waves came the most decisive innovation of all: the escort carrier. Small aircraft carriers converted from merchant hulls, they carried a handful of bombers and fighters that could patrol hundreds of miles around convoys. From these decks, Swordfish torpedo bombers and American Avengers hunted submarines day and night. The sea, once a domain of darkness, was no longer safe for the U-boat to surface. Technology had transformed the Atlantic from a graveyard of guesswork into a chessboard of precision. Every ping of sonar, every radar blip, every flash from a Hedgehog barrage marked a shift in power. The hunter had begun to feel hunted. Beneath the noise of torpedoes and depth charges, another war was being fought. Silent, invisible, and decisive. It was the war of information. Every U-boat in the Atlantic depended on radio. Orders from Admiral Donitz's headquarters in Lorient were sent through encrypted signals using Germany's most secret weapon, the Enigma machine. Its shifting ciphers created billions of possible combinations, a code thought unbreakable. For the first years of the war, it was. Convoys died by the hundreds because Allied commanders simply didn't know where the wolf packs were waiting. But inside a quiet English estate called Bletchley Park, mathematicians, linguists, and engineers waged their own battle. Led by minds like Alan Turing, they built machines, early computers, that could pierce Enigma's shifting walls. By 1941, their success began to bear fruit. Codenamed Ultra, the intercepted and decrypted messages revealed U-boat positions, convoy routes, and tactical intentions. The breakthrough was guarded with absolute secrecy. Convoys were sometimes sacrificed to protect the secret. Even escort captains often didn't know that their sudden rerouting came from decoded German messages. But the results were transformative. Entire wolf packs sailed into empty seas, while Allied destroyers converged on U-boats with uncanny precision. Alongside Ultra came another silent ally, HFDF, or Huff Duff. It was a system of high-frequency direction finding that allowed Allied ships to triangulate U-boat radio transmissions within minutes. Whenever a submarine reported a sighting, multiple stations, from ships and coastal posts, could pinpoint its location almost instantly. The combination of Ultra and HFDF turned the Atlantic into a trap. The U-boats, once invisible, now left digital footprints across the ocean. They didn't know it yet, but the Allies could hear their whispers. Intelligence had become the ultimate weapon. Unseen, unemotional, devastatingly effective. And as the convoys grew stronger, these tools of science and secrecy would meet the brutal test of battle, the tactical war that awaited in the heart of the Atlantic. By 1942, the Atlantic had become an underwater chessboard, one ruled by silence, patience, and terror. Admiral Karl Dönitz's U-boats hunted in wolf packs, groups of submarines spread across wide patrol lines. When a single U-boat spotted a convoy, it shadowed silently, sending contact reports back to headquarters. Within hours, a dozen submarines could converge from all sides, striking under the cover of night. Their tactic was simple and savage. Surfaced at dusk, the U-boats attacked like raiders, weaving between merchant ships and launching torpedoes at point-blank range. Convoy escorts, often outnumbered and exhausted, fired blindly into the dark. The sea lit up with explosions, burning oil and tracer fire reflected on the waves. But by late 1942, the Allies adapted. Convoy escorts began operating in hunter-killer groups. Destroyers and corvettes moving in coordinated patterns, using radar and sonar to drive submarines into traps. Depth-charge barrages became symphonies of precision, calculated to hold a U-boat underwater until it was crushed or forced to surface. Air cover changed everything. With long-range B-24 Liberators closing the air gap between America and Britain, submarines lost their sanctuary in mid-Atlantic. What was once a predator's sea became a kill zone. Even the dreaded Night of the Long Knives, when U-boats swarmed convoy ONS-5, ended with disaster for the hunters. 6 submarines destroyed in a single battle. By 1943, the balance had shifted. Convoys now sailed in tight, disciplined formations, each escorted by destroyers, sloops, and carriers. The wolf packs still came, but fewer returned. The ocean, that had once devoured ships, now swallowed submarines instead. Behind every convoy was not just courage, but production. America's factories, dockyards, and assembly lines became the unseen engines of victory. When President Roosevelt called the United States the arsenal of democracy, it wasn't rhetoric. It was prophecy. Between 1941 and 1945, American shipyards launched more than 2,700 Liberty ships, one every 3 to 4 days. Each could carry 10,000 tons of cargo: tanks, trucks, food, ammunition, and the oil that kept Allied armies moving. The genius lay in mass production. Liberty ships were built from prefabricated sections, assembled like steel puzzles. In 1943, the SS Robert E. Peary was completed in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes, a world record that stunned both Allies and Axis alike. While Germany's U-boats sank ships faster than Britain could replace them in the early years, American industry reversed the equation. For every ship lost, 2 more took its place. Tankers, freighters, and troop transports streamed from ports in Baltimore, Portland, and Mobile, forming convoys with names like HX, Halifax to UK, and on outbound north. Convoy throughput became the bloodstream of the Allied war machine. Millions of tons of food fed British civilians through rationing winters. Trains of tanks and trucks crossed the Atlantic to supply the Soviet Union through Murmansk. Without these convoys, Stalingrad might have fallen, North Africa might have collapsed, and the D-Day landings might never have been supplied. Each cargo manifest was a lifeline. Each ton of steel, a statement of intent. Industry had become strategy, and logistics had become warfare. At the highest levels of command, the Battle of the Atlantic tested not just machines or tactics, but the moral endurance of nations. For Britain, Prime Minister Winston Churchill called it the struggle that kept him awake at night. "The only thing that ever really frightened me," he admitted, was the U-boat peril. Every ton of shipping sunk brought Britain closer to starvation, and every convoy that arrived meant survival for another week. For Admiral Ernest King and Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, America's challenge was coordination, balancing resources between the Pacific and Atlantic while building a navy large enough to protect both. Many criticized King for being slow to adopt convoy systems along the American coast in 1942. When U-boats ravaged unescorted tankers visible from shore. But once he acted, the turnaround was swift and decisive. On the German side, Admiral Karl Dönitz believed his U-boats could starve Britain into submission before American industry fully mobilized. His men called him the Lion of the Sea, admired for his loyalty and tactical brilliance. Yet even he could not outbuild an entire continent. As U-boat losses climbed, Dönitz faced an impossible moral burden, watching crews of young men vanish beneath the waves faster than he could replace them. The moral line blurred. Convoys became both salvation and execution. Merchant sailors were civilians, but they died like soldiers, burned, drowned, or frozen in the Atlantic's black water. The men who hunted U-boats felt the same guilt as those they pursued. One corvette captain, after sinking a submarine, wrote simply in his logbook, "There are no winners out here, only survivors." By the spring of 1943, the scales had tipped. The Allies had the technology, the ships, the intelligence, and the men to hold the Atlantic. The wolf packs were retreating, their losses unbearable, but the decisive moment, the turning point when the hunters became, though hunted, was still to come. It would arrive in a single brutal campaign that broke the back of Germany's submarine fleet and changed the course of the war forever. In the winter of 1942, the Atlantic was bleeding. It was a year sailors would later call the Black Year. The German U-boat arm, once a shadowy threat, had become a weapon of annihilation. By then, Admiral Karl Dönitz commanded nearly 100 operational submarines, each prowling the shipping lanes from the Arctic Circle to the Caribbean. The wolf packs no longer hunted in ones or twos. They hunted in tens. Convoy routes were mapped, Allied habits studied, and even the rhythms of weather were used to predict movements. For the first time since the war began, it seemed the sea itself had turned against the Allies. In January 1942, as America reeled from Pearl Harbor, U-boats began what Dönitz codenamed Operation Paukenschlag. Drumbeat. 5 long-range submarines crossed the Atlantic and began sinking ships off the American East Coast. It was an unguarded coast, brightly lit by cities that refused blackout orders. Tankers burned within sight of boardwalks. From Florida to Nova Scotia, oil slicks and lifeboats washed ashore. In just 6 months, German U-boats sank more than 3 million tons of Allied shipping. Convoy SC-94, HX-2-12, on 127. Each name became a story of courage and horror. Ships vanished into the night, their SOS calls drowned by static or jammed by enemy signals. The Royal Navy and Royal Canadian Navy fought to hold the line. Escort groups raced to protect merchantmen, but there were too few ships and too much ocean. Convoys that should have had 10 escorts sailed with 4. Crews slept in soaked hammocks, their ships rimed with ice, their nerves shredded by the sound of distant depth charges. One sailor aboard the SS Empire Hudson wrote in his diary, "Every wave carries death now. You look out into the fog, and you can feel them watching, waiting." By the spring of 1942, Britain was losing ships faster than it could replace them. The Admiralty estimated that if losses continued, the island nation would be starved into submission within months. Fuel reserves ran dangerously low. Convoys carrying food and munitions dwindled. The U-boat war was no longer confined to the North Atlantic. Dönitz expanded operations into the Caribbean, Gulf of Mexico, and the South Atlantic. Tankers bound for Allied armies in North Africa were destroyed, their flaming cargo staining tropical waters black. Even the Arctic convoys to the Soviet Union, like the ill-fated PQ-17, suffered catastrophic losses as submarines. Aircraft and surface raiders coordinated their attacks. In the spring of 1942, Convoy PQ-17, sailing for Murmansk, received orders to scatter after reports of a German battleship sortie. Without escort protection, the convoy was torn apart. Out of 35 merchant ships, 24 were sunk. Sailors froze to death in Arctic waters as their ships burned around them. It was a humiliation so severe that Churchill himself called it a disaster without equal. By the summer, the situation had reached its crisis. German radio broadcasts boasted of the Second Battle of the Atlantic, and they were right. Never before had Britain's survival hung so precariously. But even in the darkness, change was coming. Slowly, painfully, the Allies were learning. The British had begun integrating high-frequency direction finding HFDF equipment. Huff-Duff, which could locate U-boat radio transmissions. Escort captains learned to triangulate bearings and direct depth-charge attacks with increasing accuracy. At the same time, the American Navy began organizing convoys along the eastern seaboard, abandoning its disastrous early war policy of letting merchantmen sail alone. The first long-range patrol aircraft began closing the infamous air gap, the vast stretch of mid-Atlantic where convoys had once been blind and defenseless. New radar sets, though still primitive, could now detect a submarine's periscope or conning tower even in darkness. The tide was not yet turning, but the current was beginning to shift. For the men inside the U-boats, the war was also changing. What had once been a campaign of dominance became a descent into fear. Crews stayed submerged longer, haunted by the constant drone of sonar pings above. Airplanes appeared without warning. Depth charges fell like thunder. Even so, Dönitz pushed harder. He believed one final surge could still strangle Britain before American production reached full force. Between August 1942 and March 1943, he unleashed the largest wolf pack offensive in history. Black May, Convoys ONS-5, SC-118, and HX-229 SC-122 faced coordinated assaults of up to 40 submarines. The Atlantic became a graveyard of steel. Ships burned for days, and the sea carried their wreckage hundreds of miles. Yet, for every convoy lost, new ones appeared, larger, stronger, and better defended. The Allies were absorbing punishment and not collapsing. That, Dönitz realized, was the beginning of the end. In late 1942, a secret change began to unfold. The British codebreakers at Bletchley Park, using ultra-intelligence, started decrypting German naval signals in real time. For the first time, convoy routes could be adjusted before wolf packs struck. At sea, escort groups now worked in unified formations, supported by escort carriers and long-range aircraft. It was the start of an idea that U-boats could be hunted, not just endured. The Atlantic was still dangerous, but it was no longer hopeless. The nightmare of 1942 had shown the Allies what defeat would look like. The lessons learned in that crucible, from convoy coordination to code-breaking, would soon ignite a coordinated counterattack unlike anything the Germans expected. And when it came, it would turn the hunters into the hunted. By the end of 1942, the Allies were no longer reacting. They were orchestrating. What had begun as desperate survival was now an organized, intelligent system of warfare stretching across the world's largest ocean. The transformation began in rooms, not on decks, in Liverpool, Washington, and Bletchley Park. The Allied command structure was finally unified. The Combined Atlantic Command, integrating British, Canadian, and American naval forces under a single doctrine. Convoy routes were redrawn, escort groups were reorganized, and technology was synchronized across nations. This was not just strategy. It was logistics on an industrial scale. And for the first time, the Allies' vast industrial power and scientific ingenuity were fully awake. In early 1943, Convoy ONS-5, 42 merchant ships escorted by a dozen warships, set sail from Liverpool bound for Halifax. Waiting for them were more than 50 German submarines, the largest wolf pack ever assembled. For 6 days, the battle raged across the gray Atlantic. U-boats struck from the darkness, torpedoes ripping through tankers and freighters. But this time, the escorts were ready. Using HF-DF bearings, radar sweeps, and coordinated sonar attacks, they counterstruck with brutal precision. The British sloop HMS Tay and the corvette HMS Snowflake sank multiple attackers. When the convoy finally reached safety, 6 merchant ships were lost. But 7 U-boats lay at the bottom of the sea. It was the first time in the war that submariners had suffered heavier losses than their prey. The tide had turned. New tools had arrived. Not theories, but weapons. The Hedgehog anti-submarine mortar, developed in 1942, allowed escorts to fire ahead of their own path, launching a pattern of small explosives that detonated only on contact. It meant U-boats could be destroyed before they even had a chance to dive. Radar, now miniaturized and reliable, could detect periscopes breaking the surface in darkness. Lee lights, powerful searchlights mounted beneath aircraft, illuminated submarines caught on the surface at night. One flash of white light over black water, and a U-boat's last seconds began. Above the convoys, the sky filled with consolidated B-24 Liberators, Sunderlands and Catalinas, their long-range patrols finally, closing the infamous mid-Atlantic air gap. What had once been a sanctuary for submarines was now a trap. Every signal, transmission from a U-boat, every burst of Morse was a potential death sentence. Within hours, Allied direction-finding teams could pinpoint its location, reroute convoys, or dispatch hunter-killer groups to intercept. The Germans began calling it the Second Dunkirk, not for a retreat on land, but beneath the waves. Then came the escort carriers, small, fast, and deadly. Converted merchant hulls carrying a handful of aircraft, they sailed directly with the convoys, giving constant air cover in areas where land-based planes couldn't reach. From their decks launched Grumman Avengers, Swordfish, and Wildcats, aircraft equipped with radar and depth charges. They could spot a periscope wake and dive to attack within seconds. The convoy was no longer a helpless target. It was a moving fortress. One of the first escort carriers, USS Bogue, became legendary in 1943. Operating with her destroyer screen, she sank 13 U-boats in 6 months. Her success proved the concept. Control the air, and the sea follows. By May 1943, the German U-boat force faced annihilation. That month alone, 41 submarines were sunk, a loss rate of 25% of all boats at sea. Convoy SC-130, escorted by the British 2nd Support Group, demonstrated the new doctrine perfectly. Led by Captain Frederick Walker, the group used ultra-decrypts, HF-DF bearings, and radar sweeps to anticipate wolfpack ambushes. In one continuous chase lasting 4 days, they destroyed 6 U-boats without losing a single merchantman. Dönitz's reports to Hitler grew increasingly grim. He admitted that the enemy's air and radar defenses now make the North Atlantic almost impassable. The wolfpacks were dying faster than they could be built. In late May, Dönitz made a fateful decision. He ordered a full withdrawal from the North Atlantic. The Battle of the Atlantic, the longest campaign of the Second World War, had turned. Behind the scenes, America's industrial machine had rewritten the rules of warfare. Liberty ships, crude, simple, and fast to produce, were being launched at a rate of 1 every 3 days. In 1943 alone, American yards built 2,700 merchant ships and 600 escort vessels. Every time a U-boat sent a freighter to the bottom, 3 more left the docks at Newport News, Mobile, or San Francisco, and intelligence, the invisible weapon, had matured. Ultra-decrypts, once sporadic, now provided continuous insight into U-boat positions and orders. The Allies no longer guessed. They anticipated. They fought the war of information and won it. By summer 1943, the U-boat fleet was no longer a predator. It was prey, hunted relentlessly by ships, aircraft, and machines. The ocean that had once favored the hunter now belonged to the hunted's enemies. On the evening of May 24, 1943, a single U-boat, U-640, radioed its position to headquarters. Allied HF-DF stations triangulated the signal within minutes. An aircraft from the USS Bogue attacked the location at dawn. Oil, debris, and bodies surfaced briefly. Then, nothing. It was the 41st submarine lost that month. The message that reached Dönitz was brief, almost clinical. Enemy air power and radar no longer allow effective operations. Withdraw U-boats from North Atlantic. After nearly 4 years of terror, the Atlantic fell quiet. The hunters were gone, and in their absence, the convoys, those slow, battered lifelines of democracy, steamed on without fear. The sea was theirs again. When the last U-boats withdrew from the North Atlantic in May 1943, the longest continuous battle of the Second World War entered its final act. For the first time in nearly 4 years, the convoy routes between America and Britain were secure. The change was visible not in speeches or headlines, but in silence. The absence of SOS calls, the stillness on radio frequencies that had once carried daily cries for help. The numbers told the story better than any propaganda could. In the first half of 1942, Allied merchant losses had averaged 700,000 tons per month. By the summer of 1943, that figure had fallen below 100,000 tons, a reduction so dramatic that it stunned even the Admiralty. In the same period, the German Navy's losses skyrocketed. U-boat sinkings rose from 9 in January to 41 in May. The hunter-killer ratio had reversed entirely. German Naval Command could no longer ignore the arithmetic of defeat. Admiral Karl Dönitz, once convinced his fleet could starve Britain into surrender, now faced annihilation. He withdrew his boats from the North Atlantic and ordered a redeployment to less defended waters, the Bay of Biscay, the Arctic routes, and the South Atlantic. But none of these regions offered the same strategic value. The great convoy lanes between New York, Halifax, and Liverpool were now unassailable. Dönitz attempted to modernize his fleet, pushing for the development of the Type WW2 U-boat, a revolutionary new design capable of long underwater endurance. But it was too late. German shipyards, under constant Allied bombing, could not produce them in numbers before the war's end. The once proud U-boat arm, which had sunk over 2,700 Allied vessels since 1939, was now losing submarines faster than they could be built. The tactical innovations that had saved the convoys were now standard procedure. Every Atlantic crossing operated under the protective umbrella of air patrols, HF-DF tracking, and escort carriers. Convoy coordination became a science. Escort groups trained together, hunted together, and rotated as cohesive units. The Atlantic, once an ungoverned wilderness, had become a system of moving fortresses linked by intelligence, radar, and discipline. The Royal Canadian Navy, which had begun the war with barely a dozen warships, now commanded over 400 vessels and bore much of the convoy burden. Its sailors, often young, undertrained, and exhausted, had matured into veterans whose endurance rivaled any in the war. The United States Navy, drawing lessons from the Atlantic, integrated its experience directly into its Pacific operations. Anti-submarine doctrine refined in the cold North Atlantic would later guide American forces against Japan. The shift in the Atlantic changed the entire operational map of the war. With the shipping lanes secured, the Allies could finally conduct transoceanic warfare without fear of interruption. Food, oil, and weapons flowed into Britain at rates unseen since before the war. The vast Allied bombing campaign over Germany, Operation Point Blank, became possible only because fuel and spare parts crossed the ocean unimpeded. To the Germans, the Atlantic's defeat was not merely tactical, it was existential. The U-boat force had been the Kriegsmarine's spearhead, its claim to parity with the Royal Navy. Its destruction meant Germany had lost its last real chance to cut Britain's lifeline. Hitler, disillusioned, turned his focus fully to the Eastern Front. The Navy, once celebrated as the Grey Wolves of the Atlantic, was now a diminished, hunted service forced into defense. The Battle of the Atlantic had lasted 2,075 days, longer than any other campaign in the war. It consumed over 30,000 U-boat crewmen, 36,000 merchant sailors, and thousands more in escort ships and aircraft. The numbers were vast, but behind them lay the operational truth. The Atlantic had become the proving ground of modern integrated warfare. Radar, sonar, encryption, aircraft, and naval discipline all had merged into one seamless machine. And that machine had achieved something no empire or navy had done before. It made the ocean itself a controlled theater of war. The tactical victory was complete. But its full meaning, political, strategic, and human, was still unfolding. For the Allies, control of the Atlantic was not just survival. It was the bridge to invasion. By the summer of 1943, the Atlantic was no longer a graveyard. It was a highway. Every week, steel convoys stretched from the Hudson River to the Mersey, carrying the arsenal of democracy eastward. Fuel, trucks, rations, and the one resource Germany could never match: time. In just 12 months, 7 million tons of cargo crossed the ocean under American escort. The Great Liberty ships, built in less than 6 weeks apiece, steamed in endless columns, one convoy after another. They carried the bones of a new global strategy: oil for RAF bombers, wheat for British families, and tanks bound for the Soviet steppes. The Atlantic victory had made the Allied world system real, an industrial organism connected by the sea. Every campaign that followed traced its lifeline back to those convoys. When the Allies invaded North Africa in Operation Torch, November 1942, it was Atlantic shipping that carried the men and materiel. When the Soviets demanded Lend-Lease aid, it was the Atlantic routes that delivered engines, locomotives, and aluminum to the Arctic ports. And when June 1944 came, when American, British, and Canadian divisions stormed ashore in Normandy, every rifle, bullet, and tank tread had once floated on that same cold ocean. Strategically, the implications were enormous. With the U-boat threat neutralized, Allied planners could finally think offensively. The Western Allies' entire concept of global logistics, a synchronized flow of men and machines across continents, depended on the Atlantic remaining open. It was not simply a naval victory, it was the foundation of global projection of power. Germany, meanwhile, was strangled. With its U-boats neutralized and its ports bombed, its naval war collapsed inward. The Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front could no longer rely on imports of critical materials like Swedish iron ore or Romanian oil shipped via the sea. Hitler's attempt to blockade Britain had turned into a blockade of his own empire. But beyond the grand strategy and the figures lay the human story. Quieter, harder, and more enduring. Of the 185,000 sailors who served in the British Merchant Navy during the war, over 36,000 were killed, a higher proportional loss than any other branch of the British services. Most died not in battle but in fire and freezing water, hundreds of miles from land. American merchant crews suffered heavily too. Few received military honors, though they sailed the same routes under the same bombs and torpedoes. To them, victory did not feel like triumph. It felt like exhaustion. The war's end did not erase the memories of lifeboats adrift in black seas or comrades vanishing in flashes of oil fire. For many, the Atlantic never let them go. Survivors spoke of its silence, the emptiness after years of tension. The public, however, saw only abundance. By 1944, Britain was once again well-fed, its factories humming, its cities alive with American goods. The Battle of the Atlantic faded into the background of larger headlines: Normandy, Market Garden, the fall of Berlin. Yet without the men who kept the sea lanes open, none of those stories could have been written. Churchill, in a rare moment of reflection after victory, called the campaign the dominating factor all through the war. Everything else depended upon it. He was right. The Battle of the Atlantic was not just a fight for ships. It was a fight for civilization's supply line. When peace finally came in 1945, convoys continued to cross, this time carrying home the survivors and the materials to rebuild what had been destroyed. The ocean that had been a battlefield became a bridge once again. But beneath that surface, thousands of ships and submarines still slept in the deep, silent witnesses to the years when the Atlantic decided the fate of the world. And in that silence lies the question that would define the modern age. What price must be paid to keep the world connected? Because in the end, the Atlantic was not just one with steel and sonar, it was one with human endurance. In every war, there is a front that cannot be seen, a place where victory depends not on courage in combat, but on patience, precision, and faith that unseen efforts will matter. For the Allies, that front was the Atlantic. It was not a battlefield of glory, but of endurance, a place where sailors fought not for territory, but for time. Every convoy that reached Britain was a quiet miracle of coordination, of engineers, code breakers, shipwrights, and ordinary men who faced the sea as their enemy. Technology had changed everything. Radar, sonar, encryption, yet none of it worked without the steady human rhythm behind it. Every radar pulse was powered by an operator who refused to blink. Every Liberty ship was welded by hands that never saw the ocean they helped to win. The victory of the convoys was the victory of connection, of thousands of unknown people linked by purpose, scattered across the world but moving as one. The Atlantic campaign proved that industry could be a weapon, that logistics could defeat ideology, and that intelligence, in both senses, could save nations. It was the first war in which machines could see under the sea, and messages could cross the ocean faster than ships. It was also the last war in which so many lives would be risked just to keep a world supplied. When the war ended, the Atlantic grew quiet again. The convoys dissolved, the escorts returned home, and the sonar screens went dark. But the invisible system they built, the network of communication, transport, and cooperation, became the skeleton of the modern world. Every ship that crosses today's oceans sails in the wake of those who made the sea safe again. And so the story ends where it began. In darkness, on a restless ocean. The night the Atlantic stopped being safe became the night the modern world began to move. Because once America's secret convoys ruled the Atlantic, the U-boats, and the future they fought for, began to starve.